Chapter 4 Ben Shapiro and Other Dishonorable Mentions. While Harris and Peterson position themselves as above-the-fray gurus who just happen to spend all their time defending existing hierarchies and attacking the left, Ben Shapiro doesn't hide his right-wing ideological commitments. Shapiro made his bones writing columns in support of the invasion of Iraq, and before he joined the IDW, he was known as a right-wing wunderkid. Matt McManus aptly summarizes this early career in a review of Shapiro's new book, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. The subjects of his early books, with cute titles like Bullies, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences Americans, and How to Debate Leftists and Destroy Them, seemed closer to Ann Coulter or pre-Trump Glenn Beck than Russell Kirk. But Shapiro's aim in The Right Side of History is, at least in part, to rebrand himself in the image of his IDW colleagues. Rather than another disposable pundit who screeches conservative AM talking points, peppered in his case with superficial references to logic and reason, he now wants to be seen as someone who talks about big ideas like religion and history and Greek philosophy and the glories of the West. When he points to the rise of political anger to illustrate the decline of Western culture, he even makes a few half-hearted stabs at telling a story that blames both sides. Needless to say, his story revolves around the sort of false equivalence between woke college students and alt-right neo-fascists you'd expect from the likes of Harris or Peterson. In between an opening chapter on the relationship between happiness and moral purpose, and a final chapter remonstrating the left for returning to paganism, Shapiro spends most of his time on the greatest hits of Western civilization: Aristotle, the Bible, the Founding Fathers, and the Enlightenment. All of this might seem to contradict my argument that what unites the IDW is their desire to ignore the historical origins of contingent social structures and instead naturalise and/or mythologise them. After all, by examining the history of the West, isn't Shapiro historicising the present? Maybe, but let's take a closer look. Shapiro claims that something called Western civilization owes its greatness to two sources: Judeo-Christian religiosity on the one hand, and Greek reason on the other. Borrowing terminology from the German Jewish exile philosopher Leo Strauss, who himself took it from the early church father Tertullian, Shapiro shorthands these influences as Athens and Jerusalem. In Shapiro's telling, the apex of both influences was the founding of the American Republic. The philosophy of the founders, made material in the creation of the United States and in the continuing quest to fulfill their ideals, has been the greatest blessing for mankind in human history. The United States has freed billions of people. It has enriched billions of people. It has opened minds and hearts. In short, Shapiro confuses a fable about America for real historical events and figures. He uses history as a prop as he reenacts his preferred mythology. The notion of Western civilization has its own history, of course. In the United States, the idea of Western civilization, specifically the idea to teach Western Civ as an introductory course in university, took hold between the two world wars. In an essay entitled The Rise and Fall of the Western Civilization course, and published in the American Historical Review way back in 1987, Gilbert Allardyce described the invention of Western civilization as one of the greatest success stories in the history of the historical profession in America. The idea had a good run, but as Allardyce also noted, by the end of the 1960s, the notion had been overturned and scholars had come to see the Western Civ project as having been conditioned by two wars. Americans envisioned themselves as partners with European democracies and a great Atlantic civilization, formed from a common history, challenged by a common enemy, and destined to a common future, Allardyce writes. Unfortunately, like any attempt to tell a sweeping story about history and congeal the past into a coherent narrative with fixed identities, the effort involved quite a bit of flattening of people, cultures, and ideas. For example, an ancient Jew or ancient Greek would have held more in common with an ancient Egyptian than they would with an ancient Celt, and certainly would have had more of a connection with the Egyptians than with 20th century Americans. Simply put, Shapiro's idea of the West is an invention, a 20th century construction, and Shapiro's claims about Judeo-Christianity are, if anything, even more risible. Again, historians have shown that the idea of Judeo-Christianity didn't emerge until the mid-20th century at the earliest, and for largely the same reasons that the Western Civ course arose. The more substantial concept, the construct scholars of religion call the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, unfortunately includes Muslims, the very category Shapiro is most concerned with excluding from the West. Indeed, Shapiro's writings on Palestinians, Arabs, and the Muslim world in general has been so appalling that the easiest way to find a lot of this material now is to click through a post on his blog entitled, "So here's a giant list of all the dumb stuff I've ever done. Don't worry, I'll keep updating it." Though someone who didn't know much about Shapiro might find that title charming, the things catalogued in it are anything but. Here's a sample. 1. A column he wrote advocating the transfer, read ethnic cleansing, of all 4.5 to 5 million Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, plus the other 1.5 million or so who live within Israel's pre-1967 borders and have Israeli citizenship. 2. In 2013, a high-ranking allegedly told Shapiro that Chuck Hagel had taken money to speak to a group called Friends of Hamas. Apparently, Shapiro's paranoid Islamophobia had reached a point where that sounded like something that might be true, and so he printed it. Oops. Sorry, Chuck Hagel, the former Republican senator from Nebraska, who was an occasional voice of restraint against interventionism in the Bush era, although he did initially vote to invade Iraq in 2003, and who was nominated by Obama to be Secretary of Defense. That Chuck Hagel was indeed not an associate of Hamas. Shocker. 3. A column entitled, "Enemy Civilian Casualties Okay by Me." Enough said. In 2017, Republican Congressman Steve King tweeted about the birth rates of Muslim immigrants to Europe. Praising Dutch fascist Geert Wilders, King tweeted, "Wilders understands that culture and demographics are our destiny. We can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies." Even though it's a pretty good bet that someone with King's worldview would also put Shapiro's family in the somebody else category, at the time Shapiro contorted himself into a rhetorical pretzel trying to find a non-racist way to interpret King's comments. Maybe, Shapiro said, King was just bemoaning the fact that these babies wouldn't be properly assimilated into the West as they grew up. In Shapiro's mind, that would be a totally reasonable and non-bigoted thing to say. 2 years later, Shapiro appended an update to the column, stating, "His later open embrace of the terms white nationalist and white supremacist suggests that the first interpretation described below was not as implausible as it seemed at the time." Word. The point of highlighting these columns isn't to say that Shapiro can't learn or grow, but to underline the rhetorical game that he's been playing. Shapiro wants to rebrand himself as a refined intellect, or in the immortal and absolutely embarrassing words of the failing New York Times, the cool kids philosopher. But has he substantively changed any of his views on Palestinian human rights, US foreign policy, pluralistic democracy? No. Even if Shapiro no longer publishes pieces with titles like "Enemy Civilian Casualties Okay by Me," he still cheers on every new American or Israeli attack on an enemy nation. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, he still opposes both a one-state multi-ethnic democracy in which everyone has equal rights and a two-state settlement in which the Palestinian territories would become independent. Presumably, the residents of the West Bank and Gaza will never accept being a permanently stateless non-citizen underclass. So what does Shapiro think should be done with them? These days, he just doesn't say. though we can infer what his feelings are given that he continues to defend this 2012 tweet. Israelis like to build. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. This is not a difficult issue. Hashtag settlements rock. Indeed, in the same blog post where Shapiro lists off dumb things he now disowns, he has a separate list of stuff the left is taking out of context. This tweet is the first item on that second list. He defends it by pointing to follow-up tweets in which he clarifies that he's only talking about Arabs who participate in the Israeli-Arab conflict. Even in the rebranding exercise that is the right side of history, the assumptions underlying Shapiro's ludicrous attempt to defend Steve King in 2013 are evident. A Muslim is somebody else, who exists outside our civilization. Never mind that Judaism and Islam have at least as much in common with each other as either has with Christianity, or that the encounter between Islam and Greek reason actually happened a bit earlier than the parallel encounter between Christianity and the same Greek thinkers. In fact, if Muslim intellectuals hadn't preserved some of those texts, they wouldn't have been available to the likes of Thomas Aquinas. Shapiro's approach throughout the right side of history is to randomly sprinkle in sentences referencing some of these historical realities, just enough so that no one can accuse him of ignoring them, while still centering his narrative on arguments that implicitly ignore these complications. He never explains why the magical combination of Judeo-Christian religion and Greek reason that makes the West great doesn't also make Islamic civilization great, or indeed why he believes that these two civilizations, itself a very problematic term, are in conflict. Furthermore, in all his paeans to Judeo-Christianity, he never discusses that for much of the history of Jewish-Christian relations, the Jews were viciously persecuted. To take one particularly absurd example, Shapiro praises Immanuel Kant for developing the closest thing secular philosophy has ever come to a serious sense of reason and purpose, without mentioning that Kant referred to Jews as a nation of cheaters. My point here isn't that Kant is cancelled, but that Shapiro's failure to wrestle with these obvious points betrays an intellectual shallowness, or perfidy, that completely undermines his ahistorical and rosy view of Judeo-Christian Western civilization. He is ultimately not a serious thinker, as his annoying 9th grade world history class way of quoting great quotations should be enough to show. He always gives each figure's first and last name and birth and death years in a way that suggests he's laboriously copying this information from an encyclopedia. He's just not interested in history, or in a history that centers not on dates, but on the interpretation and analysis of highly complex causal processes. Instead, what Shapiro is interested in is in reinforcing his reactionary mythology while repackaging himself as a deep thinker. However, Shapiro's attempt at rebranding went up in flames in May 2019 when he was interviewed by the BBC's Andrew Neil. A few minutes in, Neil notes that newly passed abortion laws in Georgia, which you are much in favour of, would seem to take us back to the Dark Ages. Under these laws, Neil noted, a Georgian woman who suffered a miscarriage could be sentenced to 30 years in prison. How does Shapiro's support for such extreme hard policies fit with his new, more reasonable image? Shapiro's response was to repeatedly stutter the word "sir," claim that his support for the law followed from science, because a fetus is a human life, and to call Neil a biased liberal for attacking the pro-life position. This last part rings particularly hollow, since for decades members of the pro-life movement have insisted that only the doctors who performed abortions should be punished. When Donald Trump said in 2016 that there should be some punishment for the women who have abortions, even many pro-lifers considered this a gaffe. The needle is constantly moving though, and Shapiro is far too loyal a conservative foot soldier not to move with it. Meanwhile, Shapiro's arguments about science are typical of his hacky and superficial attempts at providing logical arguments to alienated and sad teenagers. Ben Burgess devotes a chapter to Shapiro's confusion about this subject in his book Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. Suffice to say that science can't answer normative questions such as whether a woman's right to bodily autonomy outweighs a fetus's right to life, or indeed whether a literally mindless first trimester fetus is the sort of entity capable of having rights in the first place. These are moral questions, and Shapiro's strategy is to evade their complexities by talking quickly and loudly and projecting confidence. He's a two-bit pedant who, when cornered, has nothing to offer but bluster and self-victimization. Neil started laughing when Shapiro asked him why he pretended to be an objective journalist rather than admitting to be a biased liberal. Shapiro huffily insisted that it was a serious question. Neil responded, "If you knew how ridiculous that was, Mr. Shapiro, you wouldn't have asked it." Indeed, Neil is a Tory who backed the Iraq War, denies the scientific consensus on climate change, and has worked for The Economist, The Sunday Times, and the Conservative Party. Neil then tried to explore Shapiro's history of making absurd and inflammatory statements, emphasizing the obvious point that Shapiro has done quite a bit over the years to create the kind of political culture he criticizes in the first chapter of the book. After a few questions along these lines, Shapiro stormed out of the interview. As funny as that was to watch, it's important to draw out and emphasize a distinction I mentioned earlier. Even when it comes to characters as contemptible as Ben Shapiro, I don't think people should be condemned for positions from which they've truly moved on. Absolutely unforgivable pasts are few and far between, and our default reaction to people rejecting bad views should be to encourage their growth. If Neil had been shaming Shapiro for being wrong about things he was now right about, well, I might still find the clip funny, but I would agree that it was unfair. The problem is that Shapiro's big list of stuff that no one is allowed to criticize me for now because I called take backsies is almost a parody of genuine moral growth. It reminds me of nothing so much as the scene in Oliver Stone's Nixon, in which Anthony Hopkins, playing the disgraced president, is reading transcripts of the White House tapes, crossing things out and muttering to himself, "Nixon can't say that. It makes me sound anti-Semitic." If Shapiro ever experienced a real epiphany and decided to actually rethink the substance of his views and formulate new positions that, for example, took seriously the humanity of Palestinians and other Arabs, I'd still criticize him for the 1,000 other things he's wrong about, but I'd welcome him to the basic human decency club, at least when it came to Israel-Palestinian relations. This is a point of principle, and it's one worth spelling out explicitly. The failure by some on the left to recognise that we should encourage moral growth instead of shaming and cancelling people for having gotten things wrong in the past is a big part of the phenomenon Mark Fisher brilliantly described in his essay, Exiting the Vampire Castle. Fisher wrote the essay in 2013, 4 years before his suicide, but every time I read it, all I can think is that, apart from a dated example or two, it could have been written last week. Left-wing Twitter can be a miserable, dispiriting zone. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms in which particular left-identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable, but nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue, the stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. Long before the right was dining out on endlessly clippable examples of collective performative browbeating, Fisher was outlining the serious political, emotional and moral costs and underlying neoliberal logic of call-out culture, a culture that, unfortunately for all of us, is hardly confined to Twitter. What he called the vampire's castle is driven by a priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, an academic pedant's desire to be the first to be seen to spot a mistake, and a hipster's desire to be one of the in-crowd. What should be obvious is that all of these desires are best served by a left that remains, as it has for the last century of American history, a small and insulated subculture. Of course, those under the psychic sway of the vampire's castle do not consciously desire political marginality or believe they're engaging in moralistic self-policing. But this is exactly what is happening. And if it continues, the left will fail. As Fisher says, the vampire's castle doesn't know how to make converts. But that, after all, is not the point. I'm not arguing that no one on the left has ever said or done anything racist or sexist or transphobic, or that we shouldn't care if they do. I'm also not claiming that we should disavow the historical importance of identity in favour of a simplistic economic reductionism that tells people not to worry about merely cultural issues. That's exactly the wrong way to fight the vampire's castle. What I am saying, however, is that the left, or at least the online left, suffers from a deficit of empathy, and will continue to devour each other and thus fail to win power in society if we don't reject the confused moralism that permeates so much left-wing discourse. Above and beyond everything else that's wrong with this kind of behaviour, it's an ongoing gift to our political enemies. Claire Lehman's magazine Quillette has printed nonsense about IQ that borders on a contemporary version of phrenology, the art and science of using skull measurements to determine personality traits and intelligence. It's published ridiculous capitalist apologetics, including a crude article by an Amazon warehouse worker defending the company's disgusting labour practices. It's also published a few good articles by leftists like Ben Burgess and Mac McManus, who make a practice of going into enemy territory to argue for leftist ideas. Though I back them in their incursions, we should be crystal clear about Quillette's reactionary editorial line. But here's the thing. Quillette and similar magazines don't attract attention to their toxic material because there's a massive pre-existing audience for their worst takes. Rather, they generate their readership by publishing a never-ending stream of "oh my god, look at these leftists being crazy" articles. Does the right exaggerate and lie about these things? Sometimes. But these things do really happen from time to time as well, and when they do, they cause real problems. Entire careers are built on this nonsense. We wouldn't have ever heard of Bret Weinstein if not for what happened at Evergreen College. Far too much ink and podcast hours have been spent laboriously re-reviewing his version of the Evergreen drama. Without attempting to relitigate the he said, she said of that situation this far out, I will say that I suspect that my friend and editor Doug Lane was correct to ask whether an increasingly corporatized administration was playing divide and conquer by deflecting student anger away from real decision makers and onto a professor who is arrogant and tone deaf enough about the students' legitimate anger and activism to make for an easy target. The way that activists turn their attention to this ridiculous and thoroughly unimpressive person, who nonetheless has connections, turned him into a cause célèbre for the right. Whatever else is true about all this, what matters most is that Bret and his brother Eric Weinstein are here with us now, pushing the right-wing, classical liberal pablum of the IDW. In a world where the left was just a little bit better at acting strategically, Bret might well still be teaching biology at a nice hippie liberal arts college, while Eric quietly did whatever it was that he did for billionaire ghoul Peter Thiel. Instead, we have the Weinsteins to thank as much as anyone for the birth of the IDW brand. Bret's narrative about Evergreen is one of these guys' founding myths, and Eric is the one who came up with the absurd self-aggrandizing label intellectual dark web in the first place. Bret's former colleague, Professor Nancy Koppelman, summarises his post-Evergreen success in a Medium post entitled Bret Weinstein's Second Act. Before the events that led to his resignation from Evergreen, his Twitter page had few subscribers. Now there are over 160,000. His Patreon account has over 1,000 supporters who pay between $2 and $100 each month for exclusive access to him. He speaks to international audiences. He testifies before Congress. That last detail is worth lingering on. Indeed, Weinstein has taken his aggrievement and actively supported Republican efforts to suppress free speech on college campuses. The IDW and the right in general love to have it both ways with free speech. On the one hand, if a reactionary is criticised for something they say, free speech is under attack. On the other hand, if a left-wing professor says something they find objectionable, or if too many faculty members have political views they dislike, they have no problem asking the government to step in to examine the curriculum and impose balance. Heads I win, tails you lose. That's about all that's worth saying about the Weinsteins in this dishonorable mention, but Joe Rogan is a different beast. He could easily be hanging out with cooler people than Peterson, Shapiro, Harris, or the Weinsteins, and he sometimes does hang out with cooler people. Wallace provided an uncritical platform for some people who truly suck, including several who I've written about in this book. He's recently sat down for an interesting and in-depth interview with Bernie Sanders as well as Cornel West. His show has exposed a lot of people to left-wing ideas they wouldn't have heard anywhere else. It would be foolish to dismiss the appeal of Rogan's personality and platform, a mistake to ignore that he represents the most genuinely heterodox mashup of politics and influences in the IDW. And finally, we come to Dave Rubin. About the only serious point to make about Dave, who, as I'm writing this, just announced that he was joining Glenn Beck's The Blaze, is that the IDW's endorsement of and cross-promotion with Rubin is an indication of the group's astonishing intellectual and moral bankruptcy. While Sam Harris will pal around with far-right figures like Charles Murray and has a worldview that is, at bottom, just as credulous and dim-witted as Rubin's, Dave is transparently and obviously stupid. I don't idealise or put on a pedestal those of us who talk for a living, and I still find it genuinely astounding that Dave's mind-blowingly insipid, self-contradictory recitation of a handful of right-wing homilies and talking points has sustained a career. Still, right-wing media is one of the easiest gigs in the world.